Russia's official state inflation numbers are in, and even the Russian government can't paper over their inflation crisis. Just how bad is the CPI numbers for the Kremlin? And more importantly, what does it mean for the everyday Russian consumers? But is this inflation crisis being driven from, well, frankly, the source we all know it is, the war? We're going to look at what it's like to be a spouse who's living large off of your dead husband's war money. Plus, African troops in Ukraine being sent to fight while the Russians sit back and camp and chill. And the soldier from the viral knife fight has been awarded Hero of Russia, but does he himself not want anyone to watch that video? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of these crazy stories coming to us from the war in Ukraine. Okay, so this is the craziest story, is that Russia's CPI print is in, and it is up to 9.5%. For context, guys, that is 10% higher than the rate earlier this year, right? So Russia likely hoping to keep the inflation rate around, probably something like 8%, maybe 8.5%. And now it's seeing 9.5% year over year. This means something really bad, right? Because it means that inflation is not under control, right? When you have a situation where hyperinflation is taking place, it doesn't occur linearly, right? It's a percentage growth, right? It's just like the compound interest in your retirement account. So if this were to be a chart of inflation, right, what you would see is inflation growing at 2% a year, starting very low and suddenly exponentially rising, right? It's going to look like the balance in a retirement account, but it's not. It's inflation. It's the value of the ruble. Instead of inflation is going to crank upward and the ruble is going to crank downward. In fact, when we look at the ruble USD exchange rate, or actually let's try to do, here we go. So take a look, right? This chart looks pretty much since about 2022. This is the 5-year chart. It looks about like what we will be seeing, especially if we look at the last year. You can see that from about July that you're seeing this gradual exponential decline in the value of the ruble. In fact, in the last month, you can see that it's had some really bad lows that it's tested, and it struggles to even regain even its 2024 December value, right? And so this is all an indicator that the Russian ruble and the average Russian is starting to feel the pressure from this war. This is one of the things that has enabled Putin to continue the war as long as he has, is that the Russian consumer hasn't just been insulated from it, but a little bit of inflation, particularly when that inflation is being driven by higher wages, actually feels good to the consumer. In fact, here's one story that I thought was absolutely insane. Right? Wives of Russian soldiers who are receiving massive paydays for, well, being killed by Ukrainian drones, essentially, are flaunting their new lifestyle. In fact, a 22-year-old wife shared an unboxing video of her iPhone 16 on IG. The phone, she said, was a gift from her husband who was fighting in Ukraine. The husband said, quote, "Only the best for my wife," which cost hundreds of dollars more in Russia than the U.S. So it's not just like a regular iPhone 16, right? Which in the U.S., let's see what this is going to run you. iPhone 16 in the U.S., oh my God, it's so expensive. They literally won't even tell you the sticker cost. They'll only tell you how much it costs to buy on layaway. God bless America. Here we go. This is a $1,000 phone. That's if you buy it with the phone plan. Likely, if you bought it from an iPhone 16, again, about $1,000. So we're talking about a $1,600 phone. This is likely an entire pre-tax month of salary from one of these fighting troops, which is insanely high for Russia, right? The average wage in Russia in 2024 was only about 7,000 rubles a month, or about 720 USD. So that's the equivalent of about 2 months of the average Russian's wage, right? Pre-tax is what that iPhone just cost her husband. But really, we know based on the casualty numbers that in all likelihood, it's going to cost a lot more. It's going to cost that husband likely his life. Now, what is interesting is that Russia, of course, we've talked about this, has been hiking financial incentives for signing that military contract. This has meant that for many men, particularly those with families who had no real substantial skills before, they're suddenly in demand simply because they are willing to take the massive risk of fighting with the Russian army. This means that, of course, is creating a new social class that Vladimir Putin calls Russia's new elite. This is, of course, not true, right? You can see that getting a new iPhone 16 does not put you into the Russian oligarch class. I don't know how else to tell you this. Again, just like those iPhones we saw being sold to American consumers on the installment plan, just 5 fucking years of payments of $25 a month, and you too can own an iPhone 16. But it's the sort of, it feels like wealth because you can afford some consumer goods. It is not the same thing as the level of power and influence that the actual Russian oligarchs wield over their government. And what's interesting is, of course, this wannabe influencer is being subsidized by her husband's service, right? In fact, as of 2025, men who sign a military contract in Samara will receive a one-time payment of $40,000, right? Of course, that's in addition to a minimum salary of $2,000, and in the event of a soldier's death, another $48,000. So for context, right, we are looking at absolutely insane numbers, right? So again, if you serve, as we've talked about elsewhere on this video, if her husband signs up, right, in the high worth region, gets the death payout, he's going to make $87,000 plus, remember, he's got 2,000 buckaroos a month coming his way, minimum. So, we have another $24,000, right? Meaning he's taken home $111. Now, how many months of the average salary in Russia is that? Why, that's the equivalent of, oh my gosh, I should learn how to use my calculator, right? That is the equivalent of 11 years of your working life. That is the equivalent of the average Russian working for 11 straight years, right? So the average wage US 2024, right? For context, the average salary in the US is $62,000. So that is the equivalent, as we've talked about on this channel, of going to America, right? So So we're talking about 11-ish years. Is that right? Right? 1154 months by 12. Can I do math? Yeah, 12 years times the American average wage annually gives you, this is the equivalent of offering American soldiers $800,000. Now, can you imagine if you went around places like rural Alabama, Mississippi, poor towns in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Rust Belt towns where unemployment's high, and you found just able-bodied men. You said, listen, you want to make $800,000 next year? Let me tell you how to do it. You'd get a lot of people signing up, but you would also have another problem, right? Is that what you have is this flood of cash into these economies, right? And the fact is that a lot of these regions are seeing a massive escalation. One of the reasons this iPhone 16 likely costs so much more than it does in the United States is in part because of sanctions, but also it's highly possible that it is simply a highly sought after consumer good by Russian consumers, right? There's a lot of wives like this, right? A lot of Russians who will take their higher salaries and spend it on these consumer goods. But it's not just the Russian soldiers who are spending like this. Remember, every soldier that goes to the front is a worker who can't work in the Russian economy. And the Russian economy needs workers too, because remember, there's munitions factories and a variety of other roles that still need to be fulfilled, right? If you mobilize, for example, every young person who would have otherwise been a cop, you have to pay the existing cops more. You have to compete, right, for you have to compete with the state offering $800,000 paydays. And so everybody in Russia is earning more money, buying the same amount of goods, and it's driving prices higher and higher and higher. And for now, right, it feels good to get an iPhone 16, but it's going to feel less good when that $800,000 doesn't buy you all that much, right? Imagine if a grocery trip was $2,000 or $3,000 a month. All of a sudden, making $800,000 a year doesn't feel that good. And that's the direction that Russia is headed, right? But before we talk about that, I want to mention, of course, that if you want the only combat-tested, veteran-owned energy gum, you want to get some Strike Gum. Go over to strikegum.com, 90 milligrams caffeine in each piece, right? So this little pack contains the equivalent of 5 amp energies worth of caffeine. 0 sugar, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC. If you need the thing to power you through, whether it's a long combat patrol, whether it is a hard workout, or whether it's just a rough day at work, you want Strike Gum. There's a reason 40% of the people that have ordered Strike Gum reorder, and that's because it is the real deal. Right? It's not some dirtbag energy drink that tastes like cough medicine. Tastes good, goes where you go, powers you in whatever you need to do. So check it out, strikegum.com or on Amazon. Just go to Amazon, search Strike Gum. You can't miss us. We're the highest rated gum on there. 4.8 stars, 4.9 for the tray. So check it out. The link is in the description. Okay. Now I'm here to dunk on a lot of Russians who have had, well, short, difficult lives in the military. But that's nothing compared to the African troops who are forced to fight in Ukrainian front lines. A large number of Africans have joined the Russian army since the invasion of Ukraine, and while some have voluntarily taken up arms, others appear to be trafficked into these roles. It describes actually a man calling himself Samuel who was told he was going to work in a Russian military camp doing cleaning and food prep. Instead, he found himself holding a rifle, being ordered to charge at Ukrainian positions. And that itself is insane. What's also insane is that the agency that facilitated him taking this role in the Russian military actually charged him. It charged him 4,000 euro in order to do this. That's something like $3,000 just to do it, right? Which is a lot of money when you're a military-age unemployed man in Cameroon. He was actually a scientist in Cameroon. But the fact is that the promise of a European passport and a lucrative salary made him sort of ignore the red flags. But Samuel himself actually contacted the Cameroonian embassy when he realized that the contract he signed had been altered and the Russians were refusing to provide him a copy of the document so that he did not receive his promised salary. And of course, instead of being a cook, was assigned to the military role, right? He said something we all know, that Russian commanders who sign these foreign troops get part of their salary as a kickback, and his commander likely gets part of the salary all the way up the chain, leaving very little remaining for the fighters themselves. And of course, the Cameroonian embassy pretends that they're doing nothing. They say, we don't know that you're here, which is weird because he's like, I'm on the phone with you. How do you think I'm doing that? But what I thought was more interesting is that in addition to reportedly Malians, Gambians, Egyptians, the casualty rates are massive, and that they are sent into combat in conditions that the Russians never would go into, right? This is going in without their jamming equipment. And what I found fascinating is that Samuel said that because Ukrainians avoid contact in order to preserve their manpower, the Russian army, he says, quote, I've never seen a Ukrainian since I've been here. I know people who have been here for 2 years and they've never seen a Ukrainian with their own eyes. They've never fired a bullet at anyone. There aren't even any enemies. The Ukrainians are hiding. They're running away from us. They're sending us drones with huge bombs, and that's what kills you along with the mines. He added, we have to move forward. We're not allowed to retreat. The Russians don't back down, they say. If you back out, you're tortured. If you move forward to occupy the ground. But we're poorly equipped. The Russians have machines to jam the waves of drones, but they keep them to themselves. They send us to fight and die with nothing at all, right? This is, of course, the reality for a lot of Russians as well, right? Any sort of scroll through any one of the combat footage videos, including mine on Combat Vet News, you see that Russians themselves are subject to the same conditions. It's subject to the same kind of one-way assaults. And And while specialty soldiers, as we've talked about, do remain in the rear, it's oftentimes a combination of poorly trained Russian conscripts, prisoners, other criminals, and of course, these foreign fighters recruited with big promises that end up in these most dangerous roles. And one example is look no further than the soldier in the viral knife fight video, right? This individual, of course, the video went viral in the US in the English language space, but it also went viral in Russia, in the Russian language space. And he is from the Far East Republic of Yakutia. He's a Yakut. This is an Asian ethnic minority in Russia. To give you an idea of how remote it is, here is the Sakha Republic, okay? Here is Ukraine. So as you could see, this is from the most inhospitable and remote regions of Russia. And, you know, one of the things that was discussed here is that as a Yakutian, these are people who live hard scrabble existences. And reportedly, he was actually, the actual knife in the fight was a traditional Yakutian knife. And it's highly likely that this guy, because there's a culture where you have to hunt for your meat. If you want to eat, you have to hunt that animal. And so he's likely very proficient with that knife. You know, using it likely to skin animals that have been downed. And so, but what I find fascinating is that pro-Kremlin bloggers hailed this guy, Grigoriev, for heroism, spreading incorrect claims that he single-handedly destroyed an entire Ukrainian squad, which is just not correct. And it sort of annoys me when these things happen because, like, we all saw the video. Both of those guys demonstrated an insane level of bravery and dedication, right? The Ukrainian for single-handedly charging an entrenched bunker position, throwing the grenade, spraying rounds into the building totally by himself. And of course, the Russian for not just staying in the building when the grenade was thrown, but actually when that happened, charging at the enemy, leaving his entrenched position. And while I obviously have strong beliefs about which side I believe is right and wrong in the war, at the end of the day, for those two soldiers, they demonstrated, you know, the spirit of being a soldier and a warrior. But here's what I think is most important. Grigoriev, when he heard about he had no idea that the soldier he was fighting had a camera and that video was released. Grigoriev said when he heard about it in a group chat, Grigoriev sent to his fellow soldiers a message that he said he didn't know the Ukrainian soldier had a camera on him. He said, quote, "I couldn't watch the video myself. It makes me sick when I try to remember what happened." Grigoriev could be heard saying in the audio messages. He continued, quote, "I'm scared mothers will see the video. I don't want it to be shared further. Please don't republish it on your WhatsApp story, guys." Yeah. So again, this is something where this is just a classic, and this is not exclusive to the Russian government, but the whitewashing some pretty horrific shit, and watching the way the government media machine is whitewashing a real instance of just brutality, I think is illustrative, right? A lot of times, the official government record of some of these conflicts is the only record. But now, in this day and age, we have unedited footage that pushes into the internet long before the state media machine can spin reality. And so what you end up with is these situations where you see the brutality of conflict, right? Uncensored, unvarnished. And then you watch as the state media machine spins up a narrative, right? Where it lauds these things as heroic. But nothing in that video felt heroic. It felt like two men fighting desperately for their lives. And anyway, I think if you remember and understand anything about this conflict, I think that should be it. And if you're someone who believes casually throws around war, conflict, wanting to see these things, you should understand what exactly that entails, right? There's a lot of people on both sides of the American political spectrum that they just jerk themselves off to this like Civil War fantasy bullshit. But you should understand what that means, right? And whether it's the African who says, we are sent to assault, we've never seen Ukrainians in years, they simply, drones just mow us down like grass, or this Yakutian who had to fight desperately, tooth and nail for his life. This is the reality of what it means to fight a war in the modern era. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Bill Collier, Auburn Coburn, guys, Marnie, Gina Krestikis, Gorsuch, Francis Karas, L90, and Pecha Taruru, as well as all of our lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. You guys make this whole thing possible. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.